If freedom means doing whatever one wants, why do those who live without restraint often feel the most enslaved? This question captures one of the central paradoxes of the modern world. People seek freedom through comfort, indulgence, and autonomy, believing that the absence of constraint equals happiness. Yet, the more one pursues every impulse, the more life becomes fragmented, marked by anxiety, loss of direction, and inner disorder. Al-Ghazali, the 11th century philosopher and theologian, offered a counterintuitive truth. Real freedom begins only when the self is governed. To him, self-discipline was not the denial of pleasure, but the foundation of inner coherence, the order that allows reason, emotion, and behavior to move in harmony. Al-Ghazali considered self-discipline the axis of a meaningful life, and, without it, the human being collapses inwardly, even while appearing to succeed outwardly. Contemporary life is defined by stimulation without stillness. Notifications, advertisements, and algorithmic entertainment constantly compete for attention. The modern brain, bombarded by novelty, operates under a condition psychologists call chronic cognitive overload. Neuroscience describes this as a struggle between two brain systems: the prefrontal cortex, responsible for planning and self-control, and the limbic system, which demands immediate gratification. In an environment optimized for distraction, the limbic impulses often win. The result is impulsivity, emotional instability, and a diminished ability to focus. This erosion of self-regulation leads to decision fatigue and moral exhaustion. People act reactively rather than reflectively, mistaking movement for progress. Centuries before these discoveries, Al-Ghazali described the same dysfunction as the sickness of the soul. He argued that when desire and anger overpower reason, the self loses its hierarchy and chaos, both moral and psychological, follows. Al-Ghazali's philosophy begins with a structured model of human psychology. He divided the self into three governing faculties: reason, which perceives truth and long-term consequence; desire, which seeks pleasure, comfort, and satisfaction; anger, which defends the ego and asserts control. A disciplined life, he said, exists when reason governs the other two faculties, guiding desire toward balance and tempering anger with justice. When this internal order collapses, the person becomes ruled by appetite and reaction. He called the process of restoring this balance mujahada, the inner struggle against the lower self. It is not a war of suppression, but an act of reorganization, putting the intellect back on the throne of consciousness. In modern terms, this is the restoration of executive control, where emotional impulses are integrated rather than allowed to dictate action. Al-Ghazali often compared the human being to a small kingdom. The intellect is the ruler, the desires and instincts are the servants, and the senses are the messengers. When the servants overthrow the ruler, the kingdom collapses into disorder. In psychological language, this resembles what we now call executive dysfunction, the breakdown of planning, impulse control, and long-term goal orientation. When the brain's reward system dominates, the individual prioritizes short-term pleasure at the expense of stability. Over time, this erodes both moral judgment and mental clarity. The corruption of conduct begins as a corruption of cognition. When the rational faculty is weakened, the self becomes incapable of perceiving truth or maintaining consistency. The collapse of self-discipline is not merely ethical. It is structural, a failure of internal governance. Discipline, therefore, is not repression. It is the architecture that holds consciousness together. For Al-Ghazali, self-discipline was an act of self-knowledge. To discipline the soul, he wrote, is to teach it the limits of its own appetite. He saw this process as the education of desire, not its annihilation. Discipline begins with awareness, recognizing impulses before they dictate behavior. Modern psychology calls this meta-awareness, the ability to observe one's emotional and cognitive states without immediate reaction. Mindfulness-based therapies train this same faculty, noticing anger, fear, or craving without identification. Neuroscientific research confirms that repeated restraint strengthens neural pathways in the prefrontal cortex, reinforcing the brain's capacity for self-control. In Al-Ghazali's terms, this is tazkiyah, purification, training the self through reflection, moderation, and habit until virtue becomes effortless. True self-discipline, then, is not the suppression of desire, but its harmonization with reason and higher purpose. It is freedom from compulsion, not freedom from feeling. Al-Ghazali described inner peace, sakina, as the tranquility that arises when reason, will, and action are aligned. Disorder within the self creates continuous agitation. Each ungoverned desire pulls consciousness in a different direction, producing tension, restlessness, and spiritual fatigue. Modern behavioral science supports this observation. Studies consistently find that individuals with higher self-control report greater life satisfaction, lower anxiety, and stronger emotional resilience. Consistent discipline stabilizes dopamine release, reducing volatility of mood and craving. The disciplined individual is not tense but centered. Their energy is not scattered across dozens of unfulfilled impulses. It is organized, directed, and calm. Tranquility descends upon the soul when it no longer oscillates between desires. It becomes still, not because life is easy, but because the will is unified. Among all forms of discipline, Al-Ghazali considered the discipline of intention the most essential. He warned that even virtuous actions lose their value when performed for the wrong motives, for recognition, habit, or vanity. Modern psychology refers to this as motivation hygiene, the distinction between intrinsic and extrinsic motivation. Research shows that people driven by intrinsic goals, such as mastery or meaning, sustain effort longer and experience greater satisfaction than those seeking external validation. When intention is pure, the act becomes effortless. When intention is divided, the act becomes exhausting. The highest form of self-discipline is internal alignment, ensuring that the reason behind an action is as refined as the action itself. When the motive is right, energy flows without resistance. Many resist discipline because they equate it with restriction. Al-Ghazali reversed this logic. Restraint, he said, is the condition of true freedom. Consider a musician. Only through years of disciplined practice can they improvise with ease. The skill that appears spontaneous is built upon structure. Likewise, the soul attains genuine freedom only after it has trained itself to obey what is real rather than what is impulsive. The brain functions efficiently when behavior follows stable patterns. Discipline creates those patterns, reducing chaos and freeing mental energy for creativity and insight. Discipline allows the intellect to perceive the real, al-haq, without distortion. Freedom is not the absence of boundaries, but the alignment of will with truth. How can these principles translate into modern practice? Al-Ghazali's framework aligns with what behavioral science calls self-regulation training. 5 practical dimensions stand out. Regulate sensory intake. Modern life overloads the senses. The constant influx of information exhausts attention and weakens impulse control. Limiting sensory input through digital boundaries or focused routines restores clarity. Establish structure. Al-Ghazali wrote, "Time is the life of the soul. Regular schedules reduce cognitive friction. Habits automate decision-making, conserving willpower for higher priorities. Practice emotional regulation. Before reacting, observe the emotion." Al-Ghazali called this muhasaba. Modern therapy parallels this in cognitive reappraisal, reframing emotion before it crystallizes into action. Calibrate intention. Ask before every act, "Why am I doing this?" Aligning goals with values transforms effort into meaning. Progress gradually. Al-Ghazali emphasized incremental reform, small, consistent victories that reshape the self over time. Self-discipline is not a sudden transformation, but a slow, intelligent strengthening of the will. Al-Ghazali also saw a deeper connection between discipline and understanding. To him, moral order and intellectual clarity were inseparable. "The undisciplined person," he said, "cannot see truth because the lens of perception, the mind, is clouded by desire. Attention determines perception. Without focus, there can be no insight. A restless mind, constantly distracted, cannot grasp depth. Discipline refines this capacity. It purifies both behavior and cognition, allowing knowledge to settle where confusion once reigned." As he wrote, "Knowledge without action is madness. Action without knowledge is confusion." Self-discipline becomes the bridge between the two, transforming information into wisdom and knowing into becoming. Without self-discipline, life unravels from the inside. The intellect loses authority, desire becomes impulsive, and peace retreats. With discipline, the self regains its architecture. Reason governs. Emotion serves, and intention purifies. Emotional regulation, structured routine, and clear intention build resilience, purpose, and mental health. Al-Ghazali's philosophy is not about moral austerity. It is about design, the intelligent organization of the soul. When the self is structured, freedom emerges naturally. True freedom is not the right to follow every desire, but the power to master the one who desires. The disciplined soul does not suppress life, it refines it. The disciplined soul walks lightly, because it no longer fights itself,